My stepmom sold my $40,000 inheritance and said, "It's for my shopping spree." I replied, "See you in court." Her reaction was insane. Story 1. When I was 12, my mom passed away from cancer. It was the hardest thing I've ever been through. She was the glue that held our family together, and when she was gone, everything changed. My dad, Gideon, was heartbroken. He threw himself into his work as a mechanic to cope, and I felt like I was just floating through life. My mom, though, had always planned ahead. Before she passed, she set up a $40,000 trust fund for me. I wasn't allowed to touch it until I turned 25, and my dad was named the trustee. She wanted to make sure I had a safety net no matter what happened. That money was her way of protecting me, even after she was gone. 3 years later, my dad started dating again. I wasn't against him finding happiness, but the woman he chose? Siobhan? I knew from the moment I met her that she was trouble. She was flashy, loud, and seemed to have a knack for making everything about herself. She'd show up to our house in these over-the-top outfits and act like she was doing us a favor by being there. It didn't sit right with me, but my dad was smitten. It wasn't long before they got married, and Siobhan moved in with us. She started rearranging the house, throwing out things that belonged to my mom, and making it clear that this was her home now. I bit my tongue because I didn't want to fight with my dad, but deep down, I resented her. Things really started to go downhill when Siobhan found out about the trust fund. I overheard her talking to my dad one night, saying, "Why does he need all that money? We could use it now." My dad shut her down, telling her the money was off limits and that it was meant for me. I thought that was the end of it, but I was wrong. When I turned 18, I moved out to go to college in Cincinnati. I was studying hard, trying to make something of myself, and didn't come home much. Every time I called, Siobhan would act like I was inconveniencing her. "Your dad's busy," she'd say before hanging up. My conversations with my dad grew shorter and less frequent. It hurt, but I figured he was just caught up in his own life. Then, during my senior year, I got a call from the bank. They told me the $40,000 in my trust fund had been withdrawn 6 months ago. I froze. My heart was racing, and I felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. That money was supposed to be untouchable. It was my mom's legacy, the last thing she left for me. I called my dad immediately, but he didn't answer. I left a message, then another, and another. Finally, after a few days, he called back. His voice was shaky, and all he said was, "You need to talk to Siobhan." I drove back to my hometown that weekend, furious and confused. When I walked into the house, Siobhan was sitting on the couch in a brand new fur coat, sipping wine. The living room looked different, new furniture, expensive-looking decorations. Shopping bags were scattered all over the floor, and she was watching some trashy reality show like nothing was wrong. "Where's my money?" I asked, not bothering to hide my anger. She looked at me like I was crazy and said, "What money?" "The trust fund. The $40,000 my mom left me. The bank says it's gone." "Oh, that." She waved her hand dismissively, like it was pocket change. "I needed it for a little shopping spree." "Relax, you'll make more money when you're older. You're young." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This woman had spent my mom's money, my money, on designer handbags and whatever else caught her eye, and she was acting like it was no big deal. I looked at my dad, expecting him to back me up, but he just sat there, staring at the floor. He looked defeated, like he'd given up. "Dad, you let her do this?" I asked, my voice shaking. "I didn't know," he mumbled. "She forged my signature." That was it. I lost it. I started yelling at Siobhan, telling her that money wasn't hers to take and that it was all I had left of my mom. She rolled her eyes and said, "You're overreacting. It's just money." "See you in court," I snapped. She laughed. "Good luck with that. You don't have the money to hire a lawyer." Little did she know, my mom's best friend, Nora, was a lawyer. I called her as soon as I left the house, and when I told her what happened, she was furious. "She forged Gideon's signature? That's fraud. We're going after her," Nora said. "And we're going to make her pay." The next few months were a blur of legal paperwork, bank statements, and court filings. Siobhan tried to cover her tracks, but she wasn't as smart as she thought. The bank records showed everything, every withdrawal, every transfer, and every luxury purchase. She'd even used the money to buy a new car. When the court date finally arrived, Siobhan showed up in one of her flashy outfits, acting like she was walking into a fashion show instead of a courtroom. But when the judge started questioning her, her confidence started to crack. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and even my dad testified that she had forged his signature. The court hearing was tense, but honestly, it was satisfying to watch Siobhan squirm. The judge was sharp and didn't let her get away with any excuses. Siobhan tried to play the victim, claiming she didn't know the money was a trust fund and that she thought it was family money. The judge wasn't buying it. My lawyer, Nora, laid everything out clearly: the bank statements, the forged signature, and even photos of her flashy new car and designer bags. Siobhan's lies fell apart one by one. Her smug attitude? Gone. By the time Nora was done, Siobhan looked like she wanted to crawl under the table. The best part came when the judge started handing out the verdict. Siobhan was found guilty of fraud and ordered to pay back every single penny of the $40,000. But it didn't stop there. The judge added $15,000 in damages for emotional distress, saying her actions were calculated, selfish, and blatantly illegal. Siobhan's face turned pale. She tried to argue, saying she didn't have the money to pay, but the judge didn't care. He approved a lien on all her assets, her car, her jewelry, and even the designer handbags she'd bought with my money. If she couldn't pay up, everything she owned would be sold to cover the debt. When the court session ended, I walked out feeling a mix of relief and vindication. Siobhan stormed past me, muttering something under her breath, but I didn't care. She was finished. A week later, the repossession started. I'll never forget the sight of her shiny new car being towed out of the driveway. She tried to argue with the repo guys, but they weren't having it. They took the car, then moved on to her other stuff. Watching her designer bags and furniture get packed up and hauled away felt like justice. But the best revenge came after that. Siobhan had been using credit cards to fund her over-the-top lifestyle, and without my mom's money to bail her out, she couldn't keep up with the payments. Debt collectors started calling, and she ended up filing for bankruptcy within a few months. She moved out of my dad's house shortly after, leaving behind a mess of unpaid bills and broken promises. My dad, to his credit, finally saw Siobhan for who she really was. He apologized to me for not stepping in sooner and filed for divorce. It wasn't easy for him, he'd been blindsided by her manipulation, but it was the right thing to do. He's been working on rebuilding his life, and we're closer now than we've been in years. As for me, I got most of the money back. After the court case and repossession, I recovered about $35,000. It wasn't the full amount, but it was enough to start fresh. I used part of it to pay off student loans and the rest to start a small business. Every day, I think about how proud my mom would be to see that her hard work and planning paid off, despite everything Siobhan tried to do. The last I heard, Siobhan had moved to another state and was working retail to make ends meet. I don't feel sorry for her. She got exactly what she deserved. If you're going to mess with someone's inheritance, you'd better be ready for the consequences. So that's it, Reddit. My stepmom thought she could steal my future, but I fought back and won. It wasn't easy, but seeing her lose everything was worth it. If anyone out there is dealing with a greedy, manipulative family member, just remember, you don't have to let them win. Stand up for yourself, and don't stop until you get what's yours. Story 2. I can't believe I'm even writing this. If you'd told me a year ago that I'd be here, typing out the darkest chapter of my life for strangers on the internet, I wouldn't have believed you. But I need to get this out, and maybe someone else out there will learn from my nightmare. For context, I'm Cyrus. I'm in my early 30s, married to the most amazing woman in the world, Lorelei. This story is about my mom, Zena. Yes, that's her actual name, and trust me, it's as unique as the chaos she brings. Growing up, Zena was the textbook definition of a controlling parent. She had this way of making her demands sound like they were in your best interest, even when they were entirely self-serving. My dad left when I was 10, and since then, she's been running the show with no one to check her behavior. Zena always thought she knew what was best for me, and I mean always. From what sports I played in high school to what college I went to, everything had to meet her standards. When I didn't follow her advice, it was always guilt trips and manipulative lectures about how much she sacrificed for me. I learned to keep the peace by nodding along and letting her think she was in control. It wasn't ideal, but it was easier than arguing with her. Things escalated when I met Lorelei. She's kind, smart, and has a heart of gold. We met at a local charity event where she was volunteering as a nurse, and I was smitten almost immediately. She's the type of person who lights up a room without even trying. But the second I introduced her to Zena, I knew there was going to be trouble. Zena didn't like Lorelei. At first, she was subtle about it, making comments about Lorelei's simple style or asking questions that were clearly designed to make her feel inferior. So, Lorelei, is this nursing thing your long-term plan? She'd ask with a fake smile, as if being a nurse wasn't a respectable career. Over time, her criticisms became more overt. She'd complain about Lorelei's family, who are perfectly normal, by the way, or insist that she wasn't ambitious enough for me. It was exhausting. When Lorelei and I got engaged, I hoped Zena would put aside her issues and be happy for us. Instead, she doubled down. She insisted on helping with the wedding planning, which I reluctantly agreed to because I thought it might bring us closer. Big mistake. Every decision became a battle. She didn't like the venue we chose, the guest list, or even the food. You're going to regret this, she'd say, as if the wedding was more about her than us. Then came the prenup. Out of nowhere, Zena approached Lorelei with a prenuptial agreement she'd had a lawyer draft without my knowledge. It's just a precaution, she said, acting like it was a normal thing for a mother to interfere in her son's marriage like this. Lorelai was hurt, and honestly, so was I. When I confronted Zena, she played the martyr, claiming she was only trying to protect me. We ended up moving forward without the prenup, but the damage was done. Lorelai started keeping her distance from Zena, and I don't blame her. For a while after the wedding, things seemed to settle down. Zena was distant, which was honestly a relief. Lorelai and I were happy, and I thought maybe Zena had finally accepted that I was an adult and capable of making my own decisions. I was wrong. A few months later, everything exploded. It started with a knock on the door. When I opened it, 2 police officers were standing there. They told me I was under investigation for domestic abuse. At first, I thought it was some kind of sick joke. I've never laid a hand on anyone in my life. But then they showed me the evidence, photos of Lorelai with bruises on her arms and a signed statement claiming I'd been violent towards her. I felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. The photos were horrifying, but they weren't real. Lorelai was standing right next to me, just as shocked as I was. She swore she hadn't filed any report, and I believed her. None of it made sense. Who would do something like this? The police explained that they had to investigate the claims, even if Lorelai denied them. They asked us a million questions and treated me like I was guilty from the start. My job put me on unpaid leave while the investigation was pending, and rumors started spreading in our community. Even though Lorelai defended me, the stress of it all started taking a toll on our marriage. Friends who used to trust me started acting distant, and I felt like my entire life was unraveling. Then came the realization, this had to be Zena's doing. At first, I didn't want to believe it. Who does something like this to their own child? But the more I thought about it, the more the pieces fell into place. Zena had access to the personal details in the police report, and she'd always been critical of Lorelai. It was exactly the kind of thing she'd do to save me from what she saw as a bad decision. When I confronted her, she didn't even bother denying it. She actually smiled and said, "I'm doing this for you, Cyrus. You'll thank me one day." I saw red. She had gone out of her way to fabricate evidence, drag my name through the mud, and nearly destroy my marriage, all because she didn't like Lorelai. And she had the audacity to act like she was doing me a favor. Lorelai wanted to go no contact immediately, but I wasn't done. I knew I needed to clear my name, and I wasn't about to let Zena get away with what she'd done. We hired a private investigator to dig into the fake evidence, and what they found was damning. Zena had used a fake email address to send the photos to the police, and the photos themselves were doctored. They were pulled from an old domestic violence article online, and she'd photoshopped Lorelai's face onto them. It was sick. We also found proof that Zena had forged Lorelai's signature on the statement. Between the emails, the doctored photos, and the forgery, we had more than enough to take her to court. I filed charges for perjury and falsifying evidence, and Zena was arrested. I wish I could say that was the end of it, but the trial was a nightmare. Zena put on the performance of her life, crying on the stand and claiming she only did what she did because she was afraid for me. She tried to paint Lorelai as manipulative, saying she'd driven a wedge between us and that Zena was just trying to protect her son. It was disgusting. When the evidence came out, though, her lies unraveled. The emails, the fake photos, and the forgery were all undeniable. The jury saw right through her, and she was convicted. Watching her be led away in handcuffs should have felt like justice, but it just left me feeling hollow. This was my mother, the person who was supposed to love and protect me, and she destroyed any chance of having a relationship. Lorelai and I are still trying to rebuild our lives after everything Zena put us through. After the trial, I thought I'd feel some sense of relief. After all, Zena had finally been held accountable for her lies. But the truth is, I felt numb. Watching my mother, the person who was supposed to be my biggest supporter, get led away in handcuffs wasn't satisfying. It was just sad. But I knew there was no going back. She'd made her choices, and I had to live with the consequences of hers, and mine. Lorelai and I decided to move away from Wichita. The gossip, the sideways looks, the pity, it was all too much. People treated me like I was either a monster or a victim, and neither version felt right. Lorelai deserved a fresh start too, away from all the chaos my mother had created. We packed up everything we owned and moved to Colorado, settling in a small town just outside Boulder. The first year was hard. Really hard. Even though Zena was out of our lives, the damage she caused lingered. My reputation at work had been tainted, so I had to start over in a new field. Lorelai was my rock through all of it, but I could see the toll it took on her too. She'd been dragged into something so vile and destructive, all because she loved me. I carried a lot of guilt over that. Zena, for her part, didn't leave us alone. She sent letters from prison, sometimes apologizing, sometimes doubling down on her lies. In one letter, she even tried to convince me that Lorelai had brainwashed me into turning against her. It was the same manipulative nonsense I'd grown up with, and I ignored every word. But one letter stood out. It was different. She begged for forgiveness. She said she was sorry for what she'd done and claimed she had changed. She said she wanted to fix our relationship and hoped I'd come visit her. I didn't believe a single word of it. Zena had never been sorry for anything in her life unless it benefited her. I didn't respond. A year after her conviction, Zena was released on parole. I found out from a relative, not because I was keeping tabs on her, but because she'd immediately started reaching out to the family to paint herself as the victim. She told anyone who would listen that I'd betrayed her, that I'd taken Lorelei's side over my own mother. She spun her usual web of lies, and some people believed her. Others reached out to me, furious on my behalf, but I told them the same thing: I don't care what she says. She's not part of my life anymore. But Zena didn't stop there. She showed up at our new house. It was a Saturday morning. Lorelei and I were having coffee on the porch when I saw her walking up the driveway. My stomach dropped. She looked thinner than I remembered, more worn down, but the smugness in her expression was the same as ever. She actually smiled, like nothing had happened. "I just want to talk," she said, holding up her hands like she was some harmless old woman. Lorelei grabbed my arm, and I could feel her shaking. I told Zena to leave. She refused. "Cyrus, I'm your mother. You can't just cut me out of your life." I stepped closer, my voice low but firm. "You did that to yourself, Zena. Get off my property." Instead of leaving, she started crying. "I did it all for you," she sobbed. "I just wanted to protect you." I laughed bitterly. "Protect me? You almost ruined my life. You framed me for a crime I didn't commit. You tried to destroy my marriage. That's not love, Zena. That's control. And I'm done letting you have any of it." When she realized I wasn't going to budge, she dropped the tears and switched to anger. She screamed at me, called me ungrateful, said I was throwing away my family. Lorelei had heard enough. She stepped forward, standing tall even though I could tell she was terrified. "You're not family," Lorelei said, her voice steady. "You don't get to hurt us anymore. Leave, or we're calling the police." That finally got through to her. Zena stormed off, muttering under her breath, and drove away. I stood there, shaking with anger and adrenaline, but also with pride. Lorelei had been through hell because of Zena, but she still stood her ground. She was stronger than I could ever hope to be. After Zena's visit, I decided I'd had enough. She didn't deserve the satisfaction of thinking she still had any control over me or my life. I went to my lawyer and started the process of filing a restraining order. I also made sure to reach out to my relatives and tell them the full truth about what Zena had done. I showed them the court records, the evidence from the trial, everything. Slowly but surely, her web of lies started to unravel. Zena had always thrived on being the center of attention, the matriarch who could control everyone around her. But now, people were starting to see her for who she really was. She lost friends. Family members stopped taking her calls. Even the ones who tried to defend her eventually gave up when they realized there was no excuse for what she'd done. The final nail in the coffin was when I sold the house I'd grown up in. It had been left to me when my dad passed, and Zena had always assumed she'd move back in one day. But I had no interest in holding on to that place, it was full of bad memories. I sold it and used the money to put a down payment on a bigger house for Lorelei and me. It was a symbolic moment, cutting the last tie that Zena thought she had over me. It's been 2 years since Zena walked out of our lives for good. She hasn't tried to contact us since I filed the restraining order, and for the first time in my life, I feel free. Lorelei and I have built a life that's entirely ours, without her poison seeping into it. We're happier than ever. Sometimes I think about Zena and wonder if she ever truly regrets what she did. But then I remember that it doesn't matter. Forgiving her doesn't mean letting her back into my life, and I'm okay with that. My revenge wasn't about hurting her, it was about taking back control and making sure she could never hurt me or Lorelei again. And that, more than anything, is what makes this satisfying. I won.